Spartans surrender all the time in our sources. Spartans are surrendering to Tegeans in the 560s, to Athenians in the 420s, to Athenians again in the 390s. Spartans surrender a lot. And this is why you get the whole body of scholars is like, yeah, no, these guys do not appear to have trained. We have no evidence that they trained.
So are you saying that the Spartans did not train for battle?
I'm saying the sources say they don't.
Are we really supposed to believe that hoplites marched in battle without any practice?
Yeah.
There is a massive debate that's been raging over the past few years about Sparta. On the one hand, you have the traditional image of the Spartans as the ancient world's most fearless warriors, an image that's been unquestioned for thousands of years. On the other hand, there's a recent group of scholars who have been arguing that that entire image is a lie, a fiction, a fabrication. Now, I invited one of those scholars on the show to present his case that the Spartans were not only unremarkable militarily, but also really bad role models for our society. As you'll see, our conversation turned into quite a spicy debate about his two main claims, which were A, that the Spartans did not train for battle and were thus not particularly skilled at arms, and B, that they could and did habitually murder their slaves with impunity. As it turns out, we did not reach an agreement on either of these points in the space of this conversation, but we did discuss the main sources that he and his colleagues rely on for making these claims. And if you're watching the video version of this episode, you'll see the passages on the screen when we get to them. So if you make it to the end, I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. Are you convinced that the Spartans didn't train for battle and that they routinely murdered their slaves? And if you're still undecided, well, at least you'll be empowered to investigate these questions further, because you'll know what the sources are that historians have to work with here. And spoiler alert, there aren't that many. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I want to thank my guest, Bret Devereux, for being a good sport and sitting through an entire interview with someone who didn't necessarily agree with him on all points. And now, here's my original conversation with Bret Devereux on Sparta. Hi, I'm Lantern Jack, and in today's episode of Ancient Greece Declassified, we're looking at ancient Sparta. Now, a few weeks ago, an article came out called Spartans Were Losers. The U.S. military's admiration of a proto-fascist city-state is based on bad history. As you can imagine, this caused quite a stir, especially on Twitter, or X, where many amateur historians criticized the article and attacked its author for distorting history. In response to which, the author and several other academics pushed back and defended the article's core claims. And the whole thing just exploded into a huge debate. So I reached out to the article's author and invited him on the program to see if we can sort fact from fiction regarding Sparta. Bret Devereux is a military historian at North Carolina State University, where he is a teaching assistant professor in the Department of History. His main area of expertise is actually Roman military history, but he has also been writing about Sparta for several years now. He has a quite popular blog, which will be linked down below, where he put out an in-depth 7-part series debunking the myth of Sparta and describing its supposedly lackluster military performance and horrible domestic living standards. Bret Devereux, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Great to be here.
So, the Spartans Were Losers. Did you pick that title, or was that the editor?
No, that is the editor. Authors do not get to pick their headlines. I believe the originally submitted title of the piece was The Dangers of Spartaganda, or On the Dangers of Spartaganda, which is sort of my pocket term for, I think, the pop cultural mystique that surrounds Sparta, which is sometimes quite thinly connected with the actual Sparta that we observe in our sources.
And how about the proto-fascist epithet? Is that something?
You will note that I do not use the word fascist or proto-fascist in the text of the piece. That was, you know, I get what my editor is trying to do there. The subheadings have to be compact, and he is looking for a compact way to say that this was not a nice place to live. That maybe wouldn't have been my choice, but then I'm an academic. My choice would have used too many words.
All right. Well, before this caused, a storm on Twitter, you were writing on your blog for a long time. You really went in depth. Just for, our audience's perspective, each of your 7 articles takes, I think, at least half an hour to read. So it's really, really packed with research and details. So what caused you to undertake this massive debunking of the myth of Sparta?
Frankly, frustration at that disconnect between where the scholarship on Sparta was and where the popular conception of Sparta was. And part of that also came out of the way that Sparta is often taught at the survey level. That I think a lot of people's experience of Sparta is they take the sort of Greek history, 100 level course. You read Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus. You are maybe not equipped to question Plutarch's claims, though, I mean, as we'll see here, like Plutarch is not always the most reliable of sources, both when he's saying good and bad things about Sparta. You need to be very cautious with Plutarch. He is the sort never to let the facts get in the way of a good story. And then that kind of very Plutarchian vision of Sparta is, of course, popularized. Works like Stephen Pressfield's Gates of Fire, which seems to have influenced Frank Miller's 300 comic quite a lot, which was obviously made into a blockbuster movie. And I had been sort of frustrated because as a scholar, I'm aware that there is this whole pile of scholarship about Sparta, and seeing this disconnect was, it drew my eye. And a big part of what I do on my blog is functionally translate the scholarship for a popular audience. Translate is the wrong word. Convey. Because in a lot of cases, these discussions are happening in publications that regular people can't even get a hold of. You get books with limited print runs that cost hundreds of dollars that you can only really get access to if you have a university library, or journals that cost even more. And so part of what I see my sort of mission is to jailbreak some of this knowledge out of academia and get it to, regular people. And so Sparta seemed a good place to go with that.
You make 2 major claims, I think, in your article. One is that Sparta was not exceptional militarily, and the other one was that it was exceptional in its authoritarianism, or let's say in its oppression of its own of the inhabitants of Sparta. So I think you used the word, it was a uniquely unfree society. Mm-hmm. So maybe let's talk about the first claim first and then move on to the second. So first, about the supposed lackluster military performance of the Spartans. Why did all the ancient sources that survive see Sparta as a formidable military power, whereas now you and your colleagues think that's a myth?
So I want to be clear about where exactly we're drawing the line here, because I am not saying that Sparta was sort of worse than par as a polis, but rather that, man for man, the performance of the Spartan army is about what you would expect for a comparable polis. And we should also just be clear here for a second and back up and talk about Sparta as a polis. Sparta, at 8,400 square kilometers of territory by the 7th century, is by far the largest polis in Greece. And I mean wildly so. The next biggest polis in mainland Greece is Athens at 2,500 square kilometers, including Attica, right? Sparta is more than twice the size. So we would expect, if Spartan warriors were entirely average, we should still expect Sparta to be a significant Greek power. It's the biggest one. The only polis I know of that has a larger territory than Sparta anywhere in the Mediterranean is Syracuse. Which is a side note. For the curious, if you're wondering, he thinks Sparta isn't the best fighting polis. What is the best fighting polis in the Greek world? Syracuse. No question. Syracuse.
You said that Sparta was very bigger than any other polis in mainland Greece, and so it stands to reason that they would win a lot of military confrontations. But that's kind of just pushing the explanation further back. I mean,
Well,
how
no,
do you
no. It
explain?
stands to reason that they would be a major power regardless, right? Sparta does not need to have the best warriors in order to be a substantial state in Greece. Realistically, if we're talking about the quality of the Spartan army, we can approach this question one of two ways. We can look at inputs or we can look at outputs. So we can ask inputs, right? Why would Spartan armies be better man for man? And we can assess those. Now, the popular image of Sparta as producing superior warriors relies heavily, for instance, on imagining the agoge as a form of military training that Spartans are learning to be experts with spear and sword and shield. In practice, if you actually read our sources, there is basically none of that. There is no evidence for practice in arms as part of the agoge, very little evidence for drill. Plato actually is one of our first sources for Greek training practice drills in arms, the hoplomachia. And this is in his dialogue, Laches. And he specifically has the Spartan there in the dialogue be like, yeah, these are neat. Spartans don't do them. And that conforms neatly to Xenophon, who puts in the mouth of a Spartan king that, yeah, we don't train that stuff. And Xenophon is both familiar with Sparta, he is a Laconophile, and an experienced military man. Xenophon's own position put into the mouth of Cyrus as his sort of ideal king was that the hoplite method of warfare required no training. The motions are all instinctual. It's not necessary. What the agoge is fitness training and conformity and obedience training. And again, our sources are explicit on this point. Xenophon is outright that what is being trained here is conformity and obedience. And indeed, this is how the system works. And so this is one thing that modern scholars point to. And like, if you think the agoge is like Marine boot camp, it is not. It is a rearing system that is not, the Spartans are not being trained to wield spear and sword differently than anyone else. Nor, as Stephen Hodgkinson pointed out in a recent article, are the Spartans at war more often or under arms more often than the average polis. They're not. They're quite typical in terms of how often Spartiates are out at war, so they're not necessarily more battle-hardened or experienced either. They may have been more physically fit than the average hoplite. But then, of course, Spartan armies aren't only Spartiates. And so just as, say, an Athenian army is going to have a mix of wealthy hoplites with really good gear and probably a high degree of physical fitness, because physical fitness in the ancient world is as much about wealth as anything, because if you're going to eat those kinds of calories and get that kind of protein, that costs a lot of money. Just as like an Athenian army would have a mix of elite, that is economic elites, to be clear, who might be fitter, and then poor hoplites who might be less fit. So too, a Spartan army is going to be, usually the composition is almost even between Spartiates and the perioikoi, and the perioikoi are going to be poorer, just from the structure of the society. What Sparta
Hold
does...
on, Brett, because you're bringing like an avalanche of information, and I'd like to take things carefully one by one. So you said that the hoplite type of warfare didn't require much specialized training, and
this is what Xenophon says. Yes.
So are you saying that the Spartans did not train for battle?
I'm saying the sources say they don't.
But we also have, very, very little evidence survives, right? Like the writing that we have. First of all, hardly anything from Sparta survives, and the writing in general that we have from the ancient world is like a fraction of a percent of what was there.
Although, amusingly, on the previous point, hardly anything from Sparta survives. We have two notable Spartan authors, right? Both lyric poets and quite early, but one of them is Tyrtaeus, who openly says that in standing next to the line, he doesn't want the biggest guy or the most skilled guy or the guy with the best armor. He just wants a brave man. So this idea of Greek contempt for skill at arms and thinking bravery is more important comes out of the mouth of one of our only two Spartan sources.
Well, that to me just sounds like the classic idea that team cooperation is more important than individual excellence. He's saying every citizen can have arete by doing their part in the line.
Right, but he's explicitly denigrating exceptional physical strength, particular valor or skill. These are not important to Tyrtaeus. What is important is bravery, is the willingness to die in the line. He has another poem about how the most beautiful thing is a young man that has been slain in his position. And I think this represents an attitude that we see reflected through the Greek sources and through later sources like Xenophon, that, again, training at arms, skill at arms, being the best dude with a sword, that is not important. That is not something they value, and it's not something they train.
Training for individual combat is not valued, but again, I mean...
But they also don't do unit drills.
But, well, when you say that this is unknown in the Greek world, what you mean is that it's unknown in our information about the Greek world at that time. Are we really supposed to believe that hoplites marched in battle without any practice?
Yeah. I would say with minimal practice, yeah. And I don't think we should actually be all that surprised. The way these guys fight is a shield and spear wall. That's a style of fighting that occurs in a wide range of societies, and it is often a style of fighting that is how you deploy untutored warriors. This is an Anglo-Saxon feared, for instance. This is a spear and shield wall, and the huscarls at the center of the line may be doing special things, but your farmers that have a spear and a shield and maybe a helmet, yeah, you put them in a spear and shield wall, and this does not necessarily require a great deal of tutoring. Yeah, discipline and maneuver is good if you can get it, but you don't necessarily have it. And of course, what we see in terms of the tactical flexibility and capability of hoplite armies reinforces the sense that they don't drill. They're generally not very capable. Even Spartan forces, which I was going to get to this, are generally more capable of maneuver in mass than the average polis. It's a thin line. And again, Xenophon makes this comment about the Spartans, that they are better at these kinds of maneuvers. Thucydides says so too. But when we say better, they're better at one particular thing. When hoplite armies advance, Thucydides describes this effect, they tend to shift to the right. The Spartans always go on the right. The Spartans are really good that when the shifting pushes them out of the line of combat, they are good at wrapping around the enemy flank and causing a cascade of failure. Right? This happens at Mantinea. It happens elsewhere. And that kind of redeployment. But anything other than...
Wouldn't that require practice?
Xenophon says it requires officers. But for instance, more complex maneuvers, an effort, for instance, to redeploy the army in the face of the enemy at Plataea goes badly and ends with bickering between the Spartan officers. An effort to pull troops out of the line and shift them to other positions, like at Mantinea, also goes badly. So Spartan efforts to do even relatively basic maneuvers, again, this sort of pull this unit out, put this unit in, is the kind of things that, for instance, Roman armies do automatically as part of their fighting style. Spartan armies are incapable of it. And I do want to note, when it comes to maneuver, the Spartans are probably the best in mainland Greece. It's just that that's such a narrow bar over hoplite armies that are just not very flexible. They're not very flexible because they do not drill.
So during this period from, let's say, 600 until 300 BC, you have Greek-speaking communities from Marseille and Spain in the west to the Black Sea and the coast of Asia Minor, Greece, southern Italy. And they are able to defend themselves against all manner of foreign adversaries militarily. The Sicilians do well against the Carthaginians. The Athenians do well against the Thracians. And then you mentioned Xenophon, the Spartans, or the group of Greek mercenaries led by Spartans do well against the Persians. Mm-hmm. The Greeks collectively do well against the Persian invasion. So this hoplite system they have is doing really well.
It works,
on the geopolitical chessboard. Okay, so you're saying this is just typical farmer, shield and spear tactics, to throw them all together, march together. It doesn't take any skill, doesn't take any practice, and yet somehow it's doing so well against.
But it is remarkably cohesive. And this, of course, is the great strength of the phalanx, that so long as it holds together a large body of heavily armored men, is really hard to get rid of on the battlefield, so long as it does not run away. That said, and we can come to this, I think the evidence that Spartan armies are in fact more cohesive is pretty limited. Everybody loves Thermopylae, and that's fair to point to, but that is just about the only time that the Spartans go down with the ship in that way. Spartans surrender all the time in our sources. Spartans are surrendering to Tegeans in the 560s, to Athenians in the 420s, to Athenians again in the 390s. Spartans surrender a lot. This is a general feature of the hoplite phalanx, is that it is very cohesive, and those cohesion bonds are built usually in the polis. What's interesting, as we're of course getting to Xenophon, is that we're beginning to see this is sort of exported, where men that have experience in the style of fighting are able to maintain that cohesion absent the social bonds of the polis, which is what we're seeing with the 10,000. But that cohesiveness is not born of training or drill. There are many ways to build cohesion. Drill is only one of them.
You say it so categorically, like as if we have a testimony that says like an ancient testimony that says these people did not drill, which we don't have. We have an absence of evidence.
No, we literally do have that. Plato has Laches say that in Laches 182d through 183a.
About what specific exercise?
About the Spartans, that they do not train in the hoplomachia for war.
Okay. Can you mention any other source besides the Plato dialogue, Laches, where someone claims that there is no training of the hoplites?
Xenophon. And obviously I keep referencing Tyrtaeus, but Tyrtaeus is also effectively saying this. And this cuts through our sources. And this is why you get the whole body of scholars is like, yeah, no, these guys do not appear to have trained. We have no evidence that they trained. We have them repeatedly telling us they don't.
So we have three data points in the texts. You mentioned Plato, you mentioned Tyrtaeus, and you mentioned Xenophon. So again,
off the top of my head.
Okay. Again, I don't think the Tyrtaeus passage supports what you're claiming. I think that it could be interpreted to support the idea of training because, again, what he's saying is that what matters is a cohesive group, which could be achieved by training, not having, two hunks next to you. So I don't think that comes down either way.
But he doesn't imagine it to be achieved by training.
It doesn't say one way or the other. He doesn't say anywhere that there's no training involved.
He does not. He does say that he doesn't value that kind of right. And
he doesn't say he doesn't value. No, hold on. He doesn't say he doesn't value training. He says he doesn't value
skill at arms.
Okay, which doesn't. Again, that doesn't mean that he doesn't value training. It means that he doesn't. That if there's some 6'5" giant who can beat everybody else in single-hand combat, he doesn't value that. That does not imply that he doesn't value group training.
No, drill seems to be unknown to him. He hasn't considered it.
Well, it's unmentioned in his poetry. That doesn't mean it's unknown to him.
That's what the word seems is there to do.
Okay. So why don't we...
but I'm sure that again, unless you can... You seem to be operating from the assumption that synchronized combat drill is a common feature of societies. It is not. It is something that we see emerge at various points historically. The Romans are doing synchronized combat drill. The Macedonians are doing synchronized combat drill. Synchronized combat drill is functionally unknown in Europe again until the 1500s. This is not something that every society does. And so it seems unwise to me to assume it, not just in the absence of evidence for it, but when you have sources actively telling you they don't do it.
Right. And I'm challenging you on the claim that we have sources actively saying they don't do that. So I would like to invite you to explore the passage in Xenophon with me that you talked about. I'm sure it's on your blog. I have it here. Let's find it. Okay, we are back. We took a small break to find our sources. And so, Bret, you found the passage in Xenophon's Cyropedia where he says what you claim he says. So could you read that passage for us, please?
Right. So this is the ideal ruler. Cyrus is proposing a military organization, and he says, each man will have a corselet fitted on his breast, a left arm a shield, such as we have been accustomed to carry, and his right arm a sword. And then in this armor, how could any one of us have any advantage over another except in courage?
Right. And why do you think that implies that they are not going to be training together and building up courage by training, marching, and exercising together?
So, I mean, for one, because
Yeah.
he doesn't say that. But two, here, the question is skill at arms. You keep merging drill for cohesion and drill for the training of maneuvers in arms. You want to be separating these two things. Those are two
Mhm.
products of drill, but they are not the same thing. Xenophon is saying that here we're not doing. No one will have any advantage as compared to, if you look upwards in the passage, as compared to bowmen and mounted lancers, for whom skill matters a great deal. That for the hoplite with the spear, the skill doesn't matter. The only advantage here is courage. Now, the question of how do you form courage? How do you create cohesion? Well, our sources have a lot to say about that, but they don't talk about drill. Again, I mean, dive through the first half of London Soldiers and Ghosts for fun on, like, Greek sources are very interested in courage. They're very interested in how you get men to hold in the line. They design their societies around it and they talk around it, and their understanding is that courage is a product of eunomia, good laws, strong social solidarity, the positioning of men in the line near relatives and family members, the positioning of your naturally bravest men at either the front or back of each individual rank. Nowhere in there are they discussing drill. The idea that you would take an army and drill them a lot in order to give them courage, that's a Roman idea. It shows up extensively in our sources for the Roman army, but it does not show up in classical Greek sources.
So I take the Tyrtaeus poem and this passage to be saying virtually the identical thing. Do you agree with that at least? I mean, we might
courage
differ.
matters, skill doesn't.
Yeah, so we don't agree on interpretation, but we agree that the point of this passage is the same as the point of the Tyrtaeus passage, correct?
I mean,
That what you just said, that courage matters, skill does not matter. That's the common claim in
yes.
both. Okay, so all right, let's look at the third passage you mentioned, which is in Plato. Okay, and there you have a Spartan, Laches, who witnesses a type of hoplite exercise in Athens, and he claims that they don't do that in Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why he thinks this type of exercise is not particularly valuable is that if it were valuable, the Spartans would do it. Because he says, I conceive that if there were anything in it, if this had any merit, this exercise, it would not have been overlooked by the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, whose only concern in life is to seek out and practice whatever study or pursuit will give them an advantage over others in war.
Yes. And again, we know from Xenophon what that looks like.
What does it look like?
Conformity, obedience, they go hunting, they're big on physical fitness.
How do they achieve their physical fitness?
The hunting, according to Xenophon, and
They're
physical
hunting
exercise in the
all
aggregate.
year round?
They do a lot of hunting. That, again, this is what our sources say. Xenophon explicitly, this is in the Laconia, right? That specifically because they are leisured, because they do no actual productive exercise, they can spend their time in activities like hunting that keep the body nimble and fit for fighting.
So as we were talking, I just remembered a passage in the Laws of Plato, which maybe you remember better than I do, but there, one of the speakers, I think the Athenian stranger, talks about exercises that the citizens of this idealized, imagined state will do, and he specifically says that some people will die in these exercises, that these are such that there's an inherent danger in these exercises that they do. I'm not saying they're drills, I don't remember, okay, but there's some kind of physical exercises, and some people will die, and he says, but to have a few people die in these drills, but have a healthy, strong fighting force as a result of that is better than to not have a good force and then potentially have many people die in a battle. So,
but again, keep in mind, Plato is writing as the idea of training at arms is emerging, and he appears to believe that the Spartans don't do it. So you're saying, yeah, Plato is imagining an ideal society. He's like, maybe they would do this newfangled thing called drill, which the Spartans don't do. which is, again, is really suggestive that the Spartans haven't been drilling this whole time.
I have to point out that that's not 100% certain interpretation, because the laws is modeled on Sparta to a large degree. Just as the Republic, but in both of his idealized societies, he's trying to synthesize what he sees as the best elements of Sparta and the best elements of Athens. And again...
and other polis.
Okay.
There's more than just two.
Sure. You just said that he seems to think that the Spartans don't drill, but we looked at the Laches passage, and
Laches literally says that. He's like, if there was anything to this nonsense, we would definitely do it, and we don't. He's
talking about a specific exercise, and you can't point to any things the Spartans do besides hunting and, whipping each other into obedience. What are they doing? How are they getting their muscles into shape? How are they building their endurance? How are they training themselves to campaign for a month at a time?
I am giving you what our sources give us.
Yeah.
This is what our sources give us. That said, I mean, the implication in Xenophon is that they do a lot of hunting. No, I mean, evidently this is a leisured elite. They have a lot of free time. But again, they are presumably doing a lot of physical fitness activities. That does not mean they are drilling or practicing with weapons.
Okay.
And I think what's remarkable here is the sort of effort to desperately try and find any hole in the evidence into which you can read something that isn't there. There's a reason that historians do not do this. If you want to posit a practice for the ancient world, you need to find evidence for it. Otherwise, we could all speculate. Most of the ancient sources are holes. Mm-hmm. But we're not here to speculate about what we don't know. We're here to talk about what we do. And we talk about what we know in terms of what the preponderance of the evidence will support. The preponderance of the evidence suggests that courage is valued more than skill. Indeed, skill isn't seen as particularly important. And we have no evidence for drill at this early point. And when drill is beginning to emerge in the Greek world, the very first guy we see talking about it, because Plato is the earliest source for the hoplomachia, which is the earliest we see drill and training at arms in the Greek world, he seems to go out of his way to indicate that the Spartans don't do it. I think all of which suggests, first, that Sparta doesn't seem to be atypical. We have a lot of sources that love to tell us about things where the Spartans are weird. If the Spartans were unusual in practicing drill or training at arms, this is exactly the sort of thing we would expect Xenophon or Plutarch to want to tell us, and they don't, which suggests that, one, Sparta is typical, and that, two, the balance of our evidence suggests that typical is that the Greeks don't do this sort of thing until really the 4th century, and it's not common until the Hellenistic period. And I think, yeah, you can take advantage of the fact that we have limited evidence to read whatever imaginary society you want into the gaps in our evidence, but this is not what historians do.
All right. I'll let you have the final word on that. And again, I haven't made up my mind. I just want to be as demanding of the evidence as possible. And speaking
it's admittedly thin.
Yeah. So let's move on then to the second of your major claims in your piece, which is that Sparta was a uniquely unfree society. And one of the horrifying features of a Spartan society that you talk about is the murdering of the Helots, who are this enslaved population of Sparta. In your blog, you talk about the Crypta, which was supposedly a kind of secret police that would also murder the Helots, or could
this is what
murder.
Plutarch says. Okay,
and you also say that it was a kind of graduation rite of passage of the agoge, that that a Sparta, before someone became a full Spartiate, they would likely murder a Helot. So what?
This is what Plutarch seems to understand, though there is. So okay, the Crypta. We have exactly two sources on this institution. We have Plutarch. Plutarch is late, though he is clearly in this passage, as he notes, he's working from Aristotle's lost Constitution of Sparta. So what we have is essentially Aristotle, but filtered through Plutarch, which is irritating. We'd rather have Aristotle direct, but there it is. And then we also have a brief one-sentence reference in Plato's Laws, 1.633, I think. That brief reference describes the Crypta as a remarkably severe bit of endurance training where Spartans wander through the countryside without shoes or servants and camp out with tents. And that's it. That's all he says. And then Plutarch comes to us and essentially says, well, Aristotle says what they're doing when they're wandering through the countryside is that they are policing the Helots and killing the ones that seem uppity. That is obviously...
Does he mention Aristotle by name, or is that...
Yes.
Okay.
In part because Plutarch is bothered by this institution, and he suggests that because Plutarch can't imagine that Lycurgus, who is a god, would possibly sanction this, he doesn't think this could date to the constitution of Lycurgus. To be clear, it's clear that none of this dates to the constitution of Lycurgus. Lycurgus is not a historical... If there was a historical person named Lycurgus, we know nothing about him. What we have are the legends Spartans are telling about him hundreds of years after his death, a life that has left no evidence whatsoever.
Just to fill in the blanks here for our listeners, Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver of Sparta who instituted all of these practices. But please go on.
Purportedly. Even Plutarch admits at the front of the life of Lycurgus that no one can agree on any of the details. Now, being Plutarch, he's like, no one can agree on any of the details of Lycurgus, and now I'm going to give you a just-so narrative about Lycurgus, because that's what Plutarch does. Again, he never lets the facts get in the way of a good story, but even Plutarch is honest. He's like, we don't know anything about this guy. So those are our two sources for the Crypta. We've got Plutarch and we've got Lycurgus. Now, those sources tend to be read in light of other things we're told, where obviously we're very thin on the evidence. We have a brief note by Herodotus that the Spartans do all of their executions by night, which is a bizarre sort of comment that has been taken to be indicative of the Spartans policing the Helots, since it's certainly the case that when we hear about Spartan executions later, they are not done by night. When the Spartans, for instance, strangle their kings, it's by day. This happens in the 300s. Poor Agus. So the suggestion here is, Herodotus is making reference to how the Spartans policed the Helots. And then, of course, you have this tricky passage in Thucydides where 2,000 Helots are promised their freedom as a way of drawing out the bravest and most spirited of the Helots, and then they're murdered. Historians have expressed some doubts about this passage. We have no source that says it didn't happen. But it seems really remarkable, right? It feels like it strains credulity, though it does suggest a general opinion among sources. And again, Thucydides is not implacably hostile to Sparta either. That it was at least generally believed that the Spartans did this sort of thing. The other obvious touch point here is Isocrates, who is implacably hostile to Sparta, so we have to be a little bit careful, but he quips in a law speech that it is a crime everywhere in Greece to kill an enslaved person, except in Sparta. And indeed, Plutarch then provides our gloss for that by noting that the Spartan ephors ritually declare war on the Helots every year, so that it is not a religious infraction to murder them. And that does seem to have been a real thing that they did. Though, again, all of our evidence for all of these societies is thin. But you can see how the balance of the evidence, right, the through line here is to suggest that the Crypta functions more or less like Plutarch says, though I would note this is a point on which there is significant scholarly uncertainty, that a lot of scholars look at this and say, okay, all of the evidence we have does suggest the Crypta functions the way Plutarch describes, but we don't have a lot of it and it's not very good. And so our confidence here is low.
So that was kind of shocking to me that there was only Plutarch to back this up. And so I went to the TLG, which is, for our listeners, a database of all the ancient Greek literature that survives, and I searched the word Crypta, and the only contemporary source, the only source within a few hundred years of Sparta being an actual independent polis, was Plato, the laws that you mentioned. Plato's description of what he calls the Crypteia does not look anything like what Plutarch describes as the Crypteia.
I think it's worth reading the passage from the Laws. So McGillis is speaking. The fourth also I may attempt to state, it is the training widely prevalent amongst us in hardy endurance of pain by means of both manual contests and of robberies carried out every time at the risk of a sound drubbing. Moreover, there is the Crypteia, as it is called, which affords a wonderfully severe training in hardihood, as the men go barefoot in winter and sleep without coverlets and have no attendants but wait on themselves and rove through the whole countryside by both night and day. So the Crypteia is a thing where men go through the countryside wandering without bedding or servants and waiting instead on themselves. I think that is actually, again, that is everything Plutarch says except the murder. Right. And that's where, like, we see there's the agoge, there is the Crypteia, and we don't have a lot of evidence about the Crypteia. The evidence we do have may suggest that it's violent, but it's thin.
No, and thank you for that clarification. So then I also checked out the Isocrates passage you quoted, which you just said says that basically Spartans can murder, and in your blog you say that Spartans can murder slaves without... it
is a crime everywhere but Sparta,
right. And the actual passage says that in Sparta, the ephors have the power to put to death without trial as many as they please, whereas in the other states of Hellas, it is a crime against the gods to stain one's hands with the blood of even the basest of slaves. So there's a particular institution, the ephors, which is like, a very important part of the Spartan government, who can put to death people without trial. How are you interpreting this passage to mean that any Spartan can murder a Helot in this institution called the Crypteia?
Again, because Plutarch says so, and he has Aristotle as his source. Like you lay out the sources. They are imperfect. You rarely get a source to just walk up and say what you want it to say. You read the evidence you have and you make an assessment. Again, the Crypteia is we are uncertain, but what our sources seem to imply is that the Spartans murder their slaves. This is what Isocrates seems to think. This is certainly what Plutarch thinks. He says it flatly. And I think we owe some deference to that, even if you're going to come away and say, in the end, this evidence is really thin.
Again, Isocrates says that the ephors have the right to put to death anyone they please. How does that support the idea that any Spartan citizen can murder a Helot?
Yeah, see, I think what you need to be paying attention to here is the back of that clause, the hatois allois here. Whereas in the rest of Greece, it is a crime against the gods to stain one's hands with the blood of even the lowest, right? And the word for lowest is getting translated to lowest here. Oikaton is like, it doesn't literally mean the lowest. It means a household slave. It is a crime everywhere else in Greece to kill a household slave. The strong implication is that it is not a crime in Sparta.
What I envision there in that passage is something like the Roman Republic in the time of Cicero, where they executed the Catilinarians without trial. That's the kind of example I think Isocrates is talking about, that when there is a perceived threat to the state or to the civic order, the ephors have the power to put to death anyone, even citizens, even perioikoi, even helots. Whereas, and the reason why this is so shocking is that in other states, even slaves have protections against murder. That's what I see the passage.
Then why does Cynodon get a trial? Cynodon's conspiracy in the 390s related by Xenophon in the Hellenica. He gets called before the ephors, but he gets a trial. There's an examination. He's questioned. He's attempting to overthrow the state. He's building a conspiracy to overthrow the state, but he is questioned.
Okay.
I don't think reading this as this is how the ephors do justice on a regular basis works.
I didn't say regular basis. The fact that the ephors can put to death anyone they think necessary does not mean that they never give trials. Just as the fact that Cicero's government put to death Catilinarians does not mean that the Romans didn't give people trials.
It also does seem relevant that Cicero is eventually exiled for that.
Sure. It does. It suggests that the ephors have this power that they can use perhaps under extraordinary circumstances. So, final question on this. Besides Plutarch, is there any other source that indicates that the Spartans could murder, or that the Spartans on a regular basis murdered Helots?
Aside from Plutarch and this quip from Isocrates.
This quip from Isocrates does not say that. So is there any passage?
I really think it does say that.
Okay. Well, I'll let her...
Whereas everywhere else in Greece, right, the implied, unlike Sparta, it is a crime to kill domestic slaves, right? The implication, it is not a crime in Sparta.
Yeah,
I think, yes, the opening clause here raises the ephors, but Isocrates is certainly implying there's something really radically different with the way that things work in Sparta than, per se, how they work in Athens.
Yes, being able to execute without trial is radically different. Where does that say anything about Spartan citizens having the right or the habit of...
Indeed, he doesn't raise Spartan citizens at all.
Okay.
He concerns himself with the oikaton, the household slaves.
All right, I'll let our listeners be the judge of this passage. Is there any other passage that...
This is it. The evidence is thin.
Okay. All right.
Right. A lot of what we know about Sparta is we are fundamentally reliant on a handful of sources. The issue here is all of the sources we're reliant on seem to think that at least some kind of violence is maintaining the Spartan state, a violence that they deem unusual, whether it is Thucydides' murder of 2,000 or Plutarch's roving death squads, or simply Isocrates' comment that Sparta is unique in not offering slaves the benefit of justice. Right. The implication here is all of our sources think there is some unique violence going on in Sparta against the Helots. And I think you can talk about how thin these sources are, but at some point you do kind of have to note that they all think that.
Right, and I think your case and the general scholarship today that claims that the Helots were treated worse than slaves in most other polis, that seems very plausible. I'm just harping on the murder thing, okay, because that's a pretty remarkable fact if it is a fact. Okay, so then let's finally turn to the demography of Sparta, which you write extensively about in your blog. What have you found there in terms of the number of slaves, treatment of slaves, all that kind of stuff?
Right. And so we move from the sort of the question of the treatment of Helots, which again our sources are uniform in viewing as unusually poor for the treatment of slaves in Greece, to the question of how many of them there are. And I think we should note at the outset here that demography in Greece is necessarily pretty deep guesswork. It is deeper guesswork than it is, for instance, in Roman Italy, where we have Roman census figures. We have less evidence in Greece, but not no evidence. Military deployments are valuable for understanding how many people live in places. We can use arable land surveys and population density estimates to check those figures. And so there have been fundamentally two approaches to the question of how many Helots there were, because no source tells us there were X number of Helots. It would be weird if they did. No source tells us how many citizens are in any Greek polis anywhere. So the first approach is to follow Herodotus' indication for the Battle of Plataea that the Spartiates bring 7 Helots for each Spartiate, giving a total of 35,000 Helots for a 5,000 Spartiate contingent, which is then matched by 5,000 perioiki to make the entire Spartan contingent. And so the reconstruction then follows, assuming that the Spartans are bringing about 2/3-ish of the citizen body, that they may be bringing about 2/3-ish of the Helot body in order to discourage revolts. And if you then proceed on that basis, calculate for women and children, keeping in mind that these are societies with more children than you might think, what you end up with is about 220,000 or so Helots against 32,000 or so individuals of Spartiate status, men, women, and children in both groups. If we assume that the Perioiki are somewhat more numerous, perhaps 40,000, which makes sense based on their military deployments. You end up with a population that is 75% Helot-ish, 10% Spartiate, and 15% Perioikoi and other non-citizens in 480 before the collapse of Spartan citizen numbers that follow. So that those percentages will get worse over time. Those numbers check out from the perspective of arable land studies. The population density they produce is not crazy. And so these are plausible figures. More recently, Figueroa posed an alternative approach, approaching the question from a subsistence level and simply asking, what is the minimum number of Helots that could possibly support the Spartan system as described to us? The math here gets really complicated, but his end-line estimate is 75,000 to 118,000, though Figueroa leaves the door open for figures as high as the 7-to-1 ratio. Explicitly in his work. That's essentially a floor, and if we rerun the math, that's about 60% Helot, 25% free non-citizen, and about 15% Spartiate, depending on where in Figueroa's range. But the number really can't be less than that based on the society described to us by Plutarch and Xenophon, because the Spartiates have no other means of economic subsistence other than the labor of Helots. They're legally barred from developing other means of economic subsistence. I should note that if you take Figueroa's bottom estimates, this implies a much more thinly peopled Sparta. That's also not crazy in that we know that Sparta is economically underdeveloped, and that's certainly what survey archaeology suggests to us. A lot of marginal agricultural land in Laconia in particular seems underutilized. What there isn't really much available space for is a much larger perioikic population, because we also have a pretty good sense of what land is Kleros land that is farmed by the Helots of the Spartiates and what land is non-Kleros land, which would be where the perioikoi would live. Non-Kleros land is decidedly in the minority, and it's mostly less productive land. It is not the good farmland, so you can't really raise perioikoi numbers very much. And so this creates...
Just to clarify, the perioikoi are not enslaved, but they're not
correct.
Citizens.
Yes, they're free non-citizens. Yes. Okay. So these are where we get our estimate ranges. And then the question, of course, is like, what does that mean? This is a society that is majority enslaved by any plausible reconstruction. More than half of the society is Helots, probably a lot more than half, but at least more than half. How does that compare? For the modern world, I mean, the easy comparison where you can be very secure about the evidence is to point out that the American South in 1860 was 32.2% enslaved. Solid number. For the ancient world, coming up with solid numbers is trickier. There is a range, but we can talk about that range. Certainly, when we look at Roman Italy, it is pretty clear from the census data that we get and population densities that make sense. The vast majority of Roman Italy's farmers are freeholders. That is free citizens that own their land. This is just required for the 700-odd thousand Italians liable for conscription for the Roman army in 225. Generally speaking, estimates for the percentage of enslaved people in Roman Italy, based on those figures and our own understanding, range from around 12.5% to 15% in 225 up to around 25% by the reign of Augustus, which is, we imagine, maybe the peak, because as we get into the empire, we actually see evidence for elite Roman estates moving away from enslaved workers towards tenant farmers.
Would their descendants have been freed?
They may have. Manumission was a meaningful part of the Roman institution of slavery. Now, most slaves in the Roman system don't have a chance at freedom, although there's also a secondary question of the rate at which enslaved people in the Roman world are having descendants. Generally speaking, reconstructions tend to assume that these are below replacement populations, so they are shrinking over time. And they're also clearly being chipped away by not overwhelming, but significant manumission. Manumission is a bigger part of Roman slavery than it seems to be for Greek slavery, though again, I want to stress very strongly, the average enslaved person in Roman Italy has like no shot at becoming free. So we don't want to sugarcoat this population. But yeah, I mean those are about our figures. Um, Moving out more broadly as we get into the empire, the general suggestion has been that across the whole of the Roman Empire, including areas beyond Roman Italy, that the rate may have been around 10%. Interestingly, census data from Roman Egypt fits neatly in line with this. This is from Bagnall and Fryer. They come up with 11% as the figure from the one province where we have really good census data. Estimates for classical Athens vary much more wildly. Walter Scheidel has suggested 30%. Bresson, in his economy of the Greek city-state, suggests 40 to perhaps 50 at the high point. 40% is also where Mogen Hermans Hansen pitched his estimate for Athens. What I think is notable here, of course, the wide error bars, wider in Greece than they are in Rome, is certainly worth noting. What's also, though, worth noting is that no matter how wide you cast the error bars, there is no overlap. The highest estimates for the slave population of Athens or Rome aren't even particularly close to the basement bottom low estimates for Sparta. And that is, of course, mirrored then in our sources, which keep talking about how Sparta's unusual slave population is a unique threat to the Spartan state. That there seems to be an awareness that there are a lot of these folks. And even at 65% or so enslaved for Sparta, this would make Sparta one of the least free states in human history, across everywhere, all the time. Very, very few societies are majority enslaved. Looking for examples, you can find individual colonies of European powers, like there are Caribbean islands where this island owned by France is majority enslaved, but the French Empire is not. Yeah. So the fact that Sparta is really unusual is very remarkable, and also horrifying when you then pair that with, again, the statements from the sources and from fellows like Critias that this was the place in the world they knew, this was the place where slavery was the worst, both the most common and the worst.
That's all fascinating stuff, which would require many, many podcasts to tease out. Final question about something we mentioned earlier, which was that Sparta was a bigger polis than any other polis in mainland Greece, and that explained in part their ability to field larger armies and win battles. But how did they get to that state of having a larger polis?
I think just Laconia would already make Sparta one of the largest polis in mainland Greece. Messenia effectively doubles their size, but again, like Laconia is already huge. It's the conquest of Messenia, but I think we should note, right, the conquest of Messenia happens in it begins in the late 700s. It doesn't seem to be completed until the mid 600s. As far as we can tell, and I know we didn't get into this was something we were going to talk about, the evidence for Spartan austerity, for this very austere, regimented society that our sources describe, archaeologically doesn't emerge until the 500s. So the conquest of Messenia is how Sparta gets big, but it seems to be done with a society that has little, if anything, in common with the leisured warrior elite that we see later. They certainly don't do burials or artwork the same way.
What do you think caused the shift to austerity?
So I think Cartledge's theory I find persuasive. I know Hodgkinson would maybe draw questions here, which is that the shift to that regimented society is a consequence of the conquest of Messenia. I don't think it's an accident that, right, the conquest of Messenia starts in the 700s, it completes in the mid 600s, and that is precisely when we see, for instance, like the deposition of Spartan bronzes begin to fall, the grave goods vanish out of the burials, right, that austerity seems to be emerging. That I think that the conquest of Messenia and the creation of that enormous class of Helots created a sort of extreme class solidarity among the Spartiate elite, though I should be quick to note this did not extend to economic inequality. There were rich Spartiates and poor Spartiates at every point in their history, as both Cartledge and Hodgkinson have demonstrated to exhaustion on this point. Read Property and Wealth in Classical Sparta.
All right, well, we could go on, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. So Bret Devereux, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the discussion.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ancient Greece Declassified. If you enjoyed this conversation, then please feel free to browse more videos on this channel. And if you like audio on the go, then check out our podcast, Ancient Greece Declassified, on any of the major podcast players. And there we have a huge back catalog of fascinating conversations on the ancient world. Thanks again.